Hi, everyone. Welcome to this FCC Zoom event on policing in Hong Kong and the United States, where we'll be discussing how to restore confidence in the police in the wake of protests and riots that have happened in both places. We have with us Professor Clifford Stott, who is a professor of social psychology at Keele University, and perhaps better known as, in Hong Kong at least, as one of the former advisors to the Independent Police Complaints Council. He was in the team of foreign experts who were tapped early on in the process to give their advice, but left late last year. Professor Stott has worked a lot on police reform, on public order policing, on best practices, and has been able to inform policy and policymaking in the United Kingdom. And we're very lucky to have him here today to discuss such an important and timely topic, especially as so many comparisons have been made between the situation in the United States and in Hong Kong. So thank you, Professor Stott. We really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and open just by asking a few questions. And at 1:30, we'll open to audience questions. So as always, please submit your questions through the Zoom chat function, and we'll try to get as many as we can in tonight. So thank you so much for that. Professor Stott, a lot has been discussed about the similarities and some of the differences between what we're seeing on the streets in the United States right now, as well as what transpired in Hong Kong last year, but obviously has gone on into this year as well. One of the things that seems to be a commonality to me is that police brutality, or the perceptions of police brutality, have really sort of galvanized people and brought them together, and sort of become a new rallying cry, a new reason why people are protesting on the streets. Can you comment a little bit about that, and how sometimes things could start as a protest or something in opposition to a certain cause, but then turn into something more about police brutality and the treatment of protesters on the streets?
Sure. Well, thanks for the invitation to come and talk today. First and foremost, pleasure to be here. I think for me, always, the first thing that's necessary to do is to challenge some of the terminology and assumption of the question. So this part of the difficulty that we have in thinking about and talking about crowds, crowd dynamics, crowd psychology and policing is that we draw on lots of deeply rooted assumptions that, when we unpack them, tend to be quite problematic. So the first thing that we need to consider here is the use of the term brutality. What does that mean? What is police brutality? And if we are careful about our terminology, we can think about things like proportionality, legitimacy. And that's really what we're trying to encapsulate when we use that term. That what we're really saying is that police use of force that we're witnessing is disproportionate and lacks legitimacy. It's not that we're saying that police use of force itself is inherently the problem, because police use of force is in effect something that is fundamental to the functioning of the state. That at some level, a state is a state precisely because it exercises some form of, or seeks to exercise some form of, monopoly over the use of force. And the police are predominantly an organisation that are deployed in that way. So what do we mean by police brutality other than disproportionality? That somehow when we witness these circumstances, be they in Hong Kong, be they in the US, that what we're saying is that there is something disproportionate about what the police are doing. So when we see a squad of police officers advancing on a 70-year-old man who's just standing there, who gets pushed over and then clearly is left unconscious on the ground, that's something that we might describe as police brutality. But as I say, what we're really talking about here is about disproportionality, that the use of force is unjustified given the circumstances in which we witness that use of force being exercised. But that's important to us because the disproportionality of police use of force has an almost direct relationship to our understanding about the legitimacy of the state, the legitimacy of police action, and indeed the lawfulness of police action, because it flows into the interaction between our judgments about police use of force and our perceptions about what is our right to do, the human rights agenda. It's our right to stand here peacefully. It's our right to stand here and express our concerns. And therefore, when the police stop me from doing that without adequate cause and justification, this is an intrusion into what I think is fundamental about what it means to live in a democracy. So you can see that once we unpack that word, we start to see so many different complex elements of what it is that we're actually trying to consider. And it's really important that we do that to get clarity about what we're talking about and why.
So you know, when the police start being seen as illegitimate, when you start having calls in society, for example, in Minneapolis and also in Hong Kong, to defund the police or reform the police, what sort of impact can that have on society? I mean, what is the effect of, you know, governance or governing when the police are seen as a sort of illegitimate force?
Well, I think in part it's useful to think back to the origins of the word police. What are the police? Where did the police come from? Well, when one looks at the history of the evolution of the concept of the police, one is always drawn back to the UK, and in particular the origins of the Metropolitan Police Service at the late 19th century. And this development grows off the back of an incident that came to be called the Peterloo Massacre. So this was the Chartists, I believe, who were protesting about the right to access universal suffrage. And in that context, the military, the militia, came in and murdered loads of people, basically. And what happened there was that the legitimacy of the state was brought into question. The reason people call it Peterloo is because many of the people who were protesting to gain universal suffrage had died on the battlefields of Waterloo. So they'd given their life for this country, but they were not accessing the right of having a say in the political system. And the suppression of that by the military started to bring to bear a fundamental political pressure on political regimes that were seeking to pretend that they were democratic. So the idea that they could sustain any form of democracy with a militarized form of social control became unsustainable. So within that, the Metropolitan Police Service was born out of these so-called Peelian principles. And what's really interesting about that development was that it was captured by an expression that I actually ironically saw on the walls of Capo when I visited, of a public, policing for the public, by the public, of the public. And the issue here was that one of the core concepts of policing itself is to draw from the communities that you seek to manage. That rather than using other communities to suppress them, you recruit from that community a form of constable, somebody who is a member of that public, who sees it as their primary responsibility to bring self-regulation to that community. And that core concept lies at the heart of what we mean, the police. So as soon as we start to encroach into the territory of militarization, we start to fundamentally undermine what it means to be a police force in a democracy. And that's really partly why it's such an issue for us. And you can understand that by looking back at the history of the concept of the word police itself.
So in watching what's transpired in the United States in the past few weeks, what do you think the police have done that have sort of gone against best practices, or what, the kind of standard sort of protest policing model is, and what has most disturbed you sort of watching what's transpired?
Yeah, okay. Again, you're going to get really annoyed with me, Shivani, because I have to sort of question it. So again, I think here it's really important. We use the term the police as if there's some kind of general approach at work in the United States. But understand there are in excess of 18,000 different police forces in the United States of America. And I think it's also the case that across the United States of America, the vast majority of protests in the Black Lives Matter program of protests since the shooting of, since the death of George Floyd have been peaceful. But what happens is that there is a media spotlight on the confrontations that distorts our perception of what's going on empirically. But where we look at the situation in America, what I see is variability. So what we see is a pattern that corresponds to a pattern that we see on a worldwide basis. That on some occasions, you find police forces and police officers who champion a kind of communication-led, dialogue-led, negotiation-oriented type approach to policing crowds. And where you get that, you tend to see moments where there isn't confrontation, where in actual fact, there's a kind of unification, a common identification between the police and the people in that moment of time. And we see a way of accommodating the expression of dissent in a way that doesn't cascade out into violent confrontation. In other areas, what we're seeing, of course, then is this really aggressive form of policing that doesn't seem to have the capacity to communicate, relies heavily on the use of force, and does so with a flavour of being indiscriminate in its relationship to the situation in front of them. And what we see there, of course, then is a corresponding increase in confrontation, increase in conflict, and also, I think, psychological change, that it drives radicalisation, because radicalisation is embedded in those kinds of dynamics. And those forms of policing are of themselves causal factors in that radicalisation.
Mm-hmm. That's a good segue actually to my next question, which is that, you know, in Hong Kong, in the Hong Kong context, we've seen a lot of government officials, we've seen a lot of police officers themselves kind of comparing the situation to Hong Kong, comparing the situation in the United States to Hong Kong, and saying, you know, look at the police brutality in the U.S. It's a democracy. Now you can understand why it's been so difficult for us to manage what's happening in Hong Kong. You know, look at the number of injuries you see of protesters, and look at how difficult it is for them to manage it. So how could we possibly, you know, have done this, you know, any better? You know, to me that seems like a slightly problematic comparison, but I would like to kind of hear your thoughts on it, because obviously it's not a monolithic thing in either place. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think for me, one of the most difficult things here is the politicization of it. You know, it's impossible to look at public disorder without looking through a political lens. Mm-hmm. And it's also the case that the rhetorical context around public disorder is inherently political. It seems a bit left field, a little bit abstract, but my background to this is actually from the UK perspective. The political issue became far more salient in the context of hooliganism than it did in relationship to protest. But what was interesting there is the way in which hooliganism itself becomes a political football. And for me, that was always because one of the primary debates through which governments sustain their legitimacy and attract their electorate is by being seen to be in control of public order. It would be unsustainable to assume that we would elect a government that was seen not to be capable of sustaining public order in our societies. But then we're left with the question, well, where does the debate about who is in control and how we control take place? Well, in the UK, in the late 90s and into the noughties, it took place in relationship to football. The hooligan menace, the British disease. Are you in control of this problem, Mr. Prime Minister? So it's a way in which governments legitimize themselves, and the way in which opposition challenges the government. And we see, for example, in relationship to the commentary of Donald Trump, that certain political positions champion certain modes of policing. So for the reactionaries, they champion the idea that somehow what we're dealing with is a pathological intrusion into normally civilized society. The agitator, the ringleader, the Antifa. And the solution to this is to somehow cleanse society, to rid it of this virus, this disease. And if we can do that, then somehow society will calm itself, become enlightened to the genuine intentions of government, and therefore everybody can be happy again. So, and there are plenty of people in society who call for the government to be like that. They want the government to be like that because they come at it from a particular political point of view. However, more sort of liberal leaning, more sort of human rights oriented political perspectives look at things in a different way. They see the origins of conflict in structural inequalities. They champion the importance of basic rights of freedom of expression and assembly, and therefore they see the deterrence mode of policing, this kind of instrumental compliance, as a fundamental challenge to how it is that the social order should be maintained under most circumstances. I mean, plenty of liberal governments will fall back on a reactionary agenda when they really need to. And even there, I think it's important to look at what we mean here about okay, then what is democratic policing? So, for example, in the UK, police officers are not in the norm armed. So where we police public order events in the UK, we use styles of policing that are referred to often in policing parlance as going toe to toe. So our officers will put protective equipment on, they'll have nothing more really than batons and shields, and they will go up and be face to face with people in the crowd. Whereas you go to sort of places like Germany or Switzerland, Italy, and they're far more reliant on distance weaponry. So they use gas, water cannon, these kinds of things. So different modes in how policing is operating. And in the UK, even when we have a kind of paramilitary formation, it's still committed to the concept of minimal use of force. And that's the issue here, really. It's about minimal use of force, given the circumstances that are in front of us. And we should all recognize that in a democracy, it is even justifiable to take life under certain circumstances. For example, if you have a guy who's been to an academic seminar just off London Bridge and pulled out some knives and started murdering people, as far as I'm concerned, it's perfectly legitimate to go into that situation as a police officer and take life. In fact, it's a necessity in order to sustain democracy. So the use of force, however far we want to take that, is at sometimes appropriate. So going back to our opening foray, the issue here is about not necessarily just the nature of force, but its proportionality based on the circumstances that we have in front of us. And that's the issue.
So given all of that, I mean, what do you think of all these calls you hear now to abolish the police, to defund the police, you know, to get rid of the police entirely? You know, it's been called for, you know, here in Hong Kong, it's been called for in parts of the US. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, it's a very, very simple expression to explain a complex argument. You know, defunding the police is actually about funding other social services. It's not saying, look, just take the money from the police and have done. It's saying, look, we give too much money to the police to deal with problems that could be dealt with without a criminal justice approach by shifting funding from the police into youth services, into mental health services, et cetera, et cetera. So part of the problem here is that the state often ends up funding police to mop up problems that it could have solved and prevented by investing in other areas. And again, sometimes that's political, that some governments come to power on an argument that says that we will get in control of public order. And you know what, we're going to fund the police in order to do that. And people who have things to protect in their life and feel vulnerable and threatened, vote for people like that to keep those nasty people away. Whereas others of political ilk say, well, no, let's fund youth services. I tend to think about funding youth services. I tend to agree with that argument because when you look at it empirically and objectively, a lot of the issues here are about failures of social services, failures of youth services, an over-criminalisation of people who are already in vulnerable positions because of their inequalities. And if we address those vulnerabilities, we wouldn't need the police in the first place, because those people wouldn't be in situations where they're committing crime.
Mhm. So, just drawing on your experience in Hong Kong with the IPCC and that process, uh, I'm curious how you see the prospects for police reform in Hong Kong, especially given that, just reading all the news and looking at my Instagram feed, in various parts of the US, you see all these really, really hopeful things of police officers, being fired, suspended, police departments already, undergoing reforms in the wake of what's been happening in the past few weeks. Do you think we'll ever see that moment in Hong Kong? Do you think we're on the right track here, or are you worried about the direction in which things are going?
Well, I mean, we're among grown-ups here. I think, what do I see? I see a sociological process at work of transition from a British colonial situation to a Chinese situation. That you're on the journey in Hong Kong to one country. It was never a matter of if, it was a matter of when and how. It seems to me that, for many years, since 2002, 2003, that revolved around the imposition of Article 23. Legco tried to push it through in 2003, and popular protests, in a sense, prevented that. We started to see it then come back in the form of, the anti-ELAB situation, and now it's been imposed from Beijing. And you're going to go into a situation where that new legal framework and governance framework is going to create a form of opportunity for the police to embed themselves as a form of secret police into Hong Kong society. And you will see a gradual erosion of freedom and liberty as a consequence of those things. And I think that that's an inevitable process that is underway. I don't think I'm alone in that kind of thought. But I see it as part of a broader set of challenges. I think that this isn't just about Hong Kong, it's about the world. We are in a situation of crisis already with COVID. That crisis is going to amplify with the biggest or deepest economic recession in global history. It's going to amplify again with increasing nationalism. In the UK, we've got potentially a no-deal Brexit to go through as a consequence of, on the tail end of all of this. And then we've got the delightful future of extreme climate change to worry about. And I think within the framework of all of those things over the next 20 to 30 years, if we can get through that with any form of liberal democracy alive anywhere on the planet, we're going to be lucky. Mm-hmm. So let's just look through the looking glass. And on what do we see? We see Trump, we see Bolsonaro, we see Putin, we see creeping totalitarianism on a global scale, increasing racism on a global scale, increasing nationalism. Where is this all going? And what are we doing about it to start a discussion, to start understanding how this is part of a global crisis that is going to get acutely worse? I think what we need to be worried about here, and again, I'm obviously sounding like a doom and gloom merchant today to everybody, but what happened after the last major global recession on a scale of the intensity about the one that we're going to go into, and that was in the 1920s and 1930s. And we saw fascism, National Socialism, Hitler, Second World War, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, try to make you give a more optimistic answer. Where have you seen police reform actually work? And what do you think the path is to, successful reforms of the police so that they can become a sort of more legitimate and more accountable force in the wake of, upheavals like what we're seeing now?
Well, it has to be a political framework. There has to be support at the senior political levels to show a commitment to a particular type of policing. So we saw that reassert itself in the UK in 2009 following the death of a protester called Ian Tomlinson. And there was a public inquiry, and that public inquiry by Her Majesty's Inspector at the Constabulary published a report called Adapting to Protest, and they subtitled it Nurturing the British Model of Policing. And what they meant there was nurturing policing through consent. And fortunately, within the UK, we've seen an ongoing political commitment to that form of policing through consent, engagement, communication at a national level. And I think where you get that political framework, then you can start to champion forms of policing within that political framework, where police commanders embrace change. They embrace taking scientific knowledge, using it to realize core potentialities that they possess to de-escalate, to develop forms of police tactical unit that deliver communication and deliver the tactical solutions that prevent escalations. And you've seen some really good examples over the years. The work that we did in Portugal, some work that we did in Australia, Sweden, Denmark, the UK. So some really good models where these have been embraced. But they are just moments in time. There's always a tendency to sort of go back to basics, in a sense, in the police. It's always a push to retain that kind of approach. And you've got to work at it all the time to defend it, to assert it, to empower it in a cultural and political context that's always pushing in the other direction.
Mm-hmm. And sorry to keep putting you on the spot with IPCC and the Hong Kong situation, but did you see in that a sort of lack of political will to actually do the hard work of reform and accountability?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a real eye-opener working on that week. I mean, it's one of the most meaningful weeks in my entire career. I learned so much. The colleagues I was working with, in particular, Sir Dennis O'Connor, I mean, talk about an impressive individual, but also just the week itself and the way that week culminated was something I would never want to experience again. I believe in the end we were put in a really, really difficult position. We were essentially, in the end, I feel, manipulated and put in an awkward position, and that was, as many people would be aware, you know, I released that tweet when I got back. I didn't do that by accident. I did it because, as far as I was concerned, we should have given that statement in Hong Kong at the press conference, but we should have given it in an open and accessible way at a press conference that everybody was invited to. And instead we were put in front of a group of people, and that I got back to the UK and there was nothing. And I just, you know, that is unacceptable. And I think in the end, what we had hoped is that the positive motivation of several people we met working for the IPCC would be realised with political support. But I think when we saw the structure of the organisation itself, the fact that it's governed by a council, the fact that that council replicates the structural biases of the political system in Hong Kong, it was to some extent becoming an inevitability that our role in that system was untenable, because we were there to champion the creation of an organisation that would genuinely work in a way that met the international standards that would normally be associated with an organisation that was there to hold the police to account. And it was increasingly clear that was never going to be the case, and that's why we walked away. And I think the publication of the report and the way that the report frames that data is validation of you know, our judgment, and there is absolutely no way I could have stood behind that report. And
meanwhile, I mean, on the contrary, do you actually see hope for police reform in the US coming out of this movement? You know, I covered policing in in the Midwest in the wake of Ferguson, and it seems to me that this is a very different moment in its scale, and also in sort of, at least in some, maybe not the Trump administration, but at least on the local level, some things seem to be being done there. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, again, police reform itself is a tricky thing. I mean, what I try to do is to work with police forces, with police officers, with police commanders, to help them do their job better. And there are hundreds of police officers I work with who I have the deepest respect for, who have gone into that job to do the job in a way that makes the world a better place. And I work with those guys. I work with those men and women to help them realize that ambition, because our crowd psychology is a tool through which you can utilize that knowledge to implement policing in a way that helps not just prevent disorder, but also defend democracy. And I think, in a sense, that's the role of the police. The role of the police isn't just to defend society from the pathological crowd. It's to defend democracy from itself, to act in ways that are inherently democratic. And you can work with police to cement that, to embrace that agenda and drive it forward. And those police forces, those police perspectives exist pretty much in more or less most police forces I've ever worked with. It's just a question of perspective and dominance. It's always a struggle. There are people in those police forces that we work with very, very progressively who don't want that change. And we have to work to, in the end, undermine them, and to empower those who have a different vision of what policing can and should be. So this is in no way, shape or form an anti-police position. It's a position that embraces working with the police and champions a particular model of how to work professionally as a police officer. And our view is that if you want to work professionally, the most important thing that you can do is draw on contemporary scientific understanding of how crowd works, so you can make more effective decisions about how you need to do the job that you want to do, that you're charged with. The problem is that there are plenty of reactionary police officers who don't want to do that because they're not interested in knowledge. They're not interested in doing the job in a particular way. They just want to champion a different way of doing policing. It's more about their power than it is about anybody else's.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'd like to open it up to questions from our viewers now. Please send your questions through the chat app in Zoom. Looking forward to your questions. But we have one here to start it off with. Chrissy Lou Stout asks, when Hong Kong police have used dehumanizing language to describe protesters such as cockroaches or yellow object or so on, has that worried you? Do you think the Hong Kong police sort of need to be trained a little bit more on implicit bias? And what do you think that the impact of that sort of language is?
Well, I think, there's a couple of things in there. I think let's tackle the first one, implicit bias. There is nothing implicit about this bias. It's perfectly explicit, obvious, and in your face. Right? So it's not a cognitive bias. It's an ideological position. And that ideological position in relation to public order has always been built upon the cornerstone of what we call classical crowd psychology, which in and of itself is inherently dehumanizing. Because what it argues is that when people get into crowds, they lose the rationality of their consciousness, that the thing that renders us a civil society is lost, and that we therefore come under the sway of mob psychology. And within that framework, you also get the spread of disorder through a process that is referred to as contagion, as if it's the spread of a disease. And that spread of disease is then attributed to the presence of troublemakers, or as the Chinese government call it, a virus. And how do you get rid of a virus? You eradicate it. You would take that virus out of society. So this form of dehumanizing language and rendering political protest as a disease is an ideological position. It's not an implicit bias. It's a conscious ideological position on the crowd that justifies and legitimizes certain forms of repressive action by the police. And that's what it's designed to do. And that's why we see it leaking out in this kind of context. So cockroaches is just a symptom of a broader underlying problem about how the police are thinking about the dynamics of crowds. And we know that that thinking about the dynamics of crowds is flawed and needs to be rejected, because that's not how it works.
So a couple of questions within a question here, but I'll try to unpack it. From Joshua Zimmerman. He points to the concrete example of the widely seen video in Buffalo, right, of the officers, shoving the older protester. So Joshua says, if we assume his language challenged the police, were the police right to use force? Was the force considered a little disproportionate or a lot disproportionate in your view? And his third question in that is, do we not need to give police the room to react disproportionately without the risk of termination or prosecution, or no one will do the job, quite simply? So that's the question. Okay, so again, a complex one there. So I think let's just consider the issue of the proportionality of that push against the elderly gentleman. So proportionality is measured against the rights that are infringed by what it is the police do. So as the police officer pushes him over, he falls and hits his head. Now that could kill him. Well, from a European Convention of Human Rights perspective, that's an Article 2 right. So if you're going to rob somebody of your life, of their life, what's the necessary justification? Is that lawful? Well, is it proportionate? Well, why did you need to do it? Was there another way of doing it that didn't require you to kill that person? I think any reasonable person looking at that would say, yeah, you probably didn't need to kill him, mate. He was just standing there. So I think you measure against, but obviously if they just pushed him and he hadn't fallen and he hadn't hurt himself, well, that's not really that disproportionate, is it? Because it's not really infringing an Article 2 right. So it's about, well, what rights are being infringed here and how important are those rights? How important is it for the police to do what they did? And how necessary was it for them to do what they did? And why didn't they, how possible was it for them to do it in a different way? That's how you think about proportionality and use of force. There's nothing inherent here. It's about the context in which it takes place and how we assess that on a legal and human rights basis. So I think the other thing here then is, do we want to give the police impunity? Do we want to create a legal context where a police officer can go to work and justifiably go out and kill somebody without being held accountable for that? No way. That's called a dictatorship. It's called a police state. That's exactly what it is. That's the legal framework that creates a police state. No, I don't want to live in a police state. I want to live in a state that is governed by the rule of law, and that rule of law applies to police officers as much as it does to me, because that's what we mean by the word democracy. Mm-hmm. So we're back on the IPCC again. Question from Maggie Ho from RTHK. She asked, were you subject to any political pressure when you were on the panel, the IPCC, when you were asked to, look into alleged sort of police misconduct in Hong Kong? And she asks, why do you say you felt manipulated during that process?
I'd prefer not to go into that, thanks.
Okay. She does have a follow-up question about accusations of police brutality in the US and what makes George Floyd's death different from maybe previous cases, whether it's more able to lead to reforms because it was caught on a viral video. Does something about the virality of the video sort of change, the push for reform? And the follow-up question is, why do you think police reforms are not happening in Hong Kong, given that there have been so many of these videos of aggressive policing that have gone viral in sort of a similar fashion, but haven't really led to much change?
Okay, so if we deal with the first one, I think the fact that George Floyd was caught on camera, the fact that his death took place in the way that it did and it was caught on camera made all the difference. I mean, obviously, if it had not been videoed, nobody would have seen it. It probably would have passed and nobody would have paid that much attention to it. It would be just another Black Death. But I think, in a sense, also that we have to see this occurring in a particular time. And that time is that at the moment, dominated by the reactions to COVID-19. And I think we need to recognize that COVID-19 is the great amplifier of inequality. So just if we look at some of the statistics around it, that you're twice as likely in the UK to die from COVID if you live in the lowest socioeconomic areas relative to the highest. You are twice as likely to die if you are from a black and ethnic minority population. You are much more likely statistically to be stopped and searched and have a fine imposed on you by the police if you're from a black and ethnic minority population. But that pattern is going to be true for poor people in general. You're more likely to suffer economic harms, educational harms, health harms from the lockdown measures around COVID if you're in lower socioeconomic positions. So what's happening here is that the measures to try to control the disease and the disease itself are amplifying the inequalities that already existed in society. And the death of George Floyd is happening in a context where those inequalities are becoming ever more salient. And it's that in some senses is leading to a situation where the protests are beginning to cascade out internationally. And within that, what we're now starting to see is the emergence of racialized tensions. So in the UK, we've had Black Lives Matter protests that have defaced monuments. And those monuments have been seen as symbolic for people who identify in terms of their national identity, and also in particular for far-right groups. So this weekend in London, we've got Black Lives Matter protesters and far-right activists who are mobilizing into the same vicinity, and there is a possibility that those groups may engage in confrontation with one another. So what we're seeing is an evolving dynamic that I don't think can really be understood outside of the framework of what's happening to us with COVID, but at the same time is about how COVID is interfacing with existing social tensions around inequality, race, and so on. And I don't think that that's going to get that much easier over time.
Question here from Matthias Bock. He actually would like you to comment on the protesters who were shot with live rounds in the Hong Kong protests last year. He asked if you're able to, if you feel like you're in a position to talk about those incidents and sort of comment on the actions that the officers took and whether you see that as proportionate.
Well, I think we discussed proportionality at length, and I'll leave it to everybody to make their own decisions about that. But one thing I think we can contribute in addition, based on that question, is the psychology of police officers themselves. That when police officers are in these situations, they psychologically are really stressed out. They get really stressed out, and one of the things around the way in which tactical formations take place. So in public order situations, you put officers into squads, and those squads have relatively high levels of command and control. So they've got lots of supervision in them, because it's understood that because of the stress, it's really important to keep people together. It's really important to keep them focused and to manage them, because they might lash out or they might go off on their own, which could cause considerable amount of problems. And I've seen on several occasions that part of the problem is where that breaks down, where command and control and commanders have been ineffective at keeping control of their officers. And those officers find themselves out in a situation where they've been poor decision making over a whole series, and you end up with a police officer in the middle of a crowd who just flips out. Bang! That's what happened, I think. And I think it was a surprise it hadn't happened till then. I think the first time I thought something like that would happen was actually up at the airport. Remember at the airport, there was a protest and there was an officer that was isolated and come under attack there. I thought that that was going to happen there. So I'm quite surprised it took that long to happen, given that police officers are armed in Hong Kong. I thought that would happen earlier. But I think that was an isolated kind of stress-related situation because the officer had got isolated in that context. And again, it's symptomatic of a broader kind of ongoing problem with policing. So when I look, I'm just writing my paper now, and been in detail through the sequence of events. I mean, the decision making around policing in relationship to the protests is remarkable. And you just look at it and think, good Christ almighty, these people, what decisions are they making? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. They're very, very poor. I mean, the protests and its policing, as far as I'm concerned, are marked by, if there's one thing that marks them, really poor decision making. And quite frankly, a lack of professionalism in the policing approach.
Good segue actually to the next question, which is from Now TV. The question is, the Security Bureau has said that they will establish a committee to enact the upcoming national security law. So it's like a separate unit of the police, I guess. Do you think the police is legitimate and capable enough to do so and implement the new national security law, which is coming to Hong Kong? And a second part of that question is, do you think the national security law will work towards reconciliation in Hong Kong society or further intensify conflict? And if not reconciliation, what do you think the government should do instead to calm tensions down and to get society sort of, back to talking to each other and moving in the right direction?
Yes, these are impossible questions to answer, really. I mean, you can merely speculate. Where's this going? I think it's going to a situation where the new law sets a parameter that basically gives even more discretion to the police to define behaviour as criminal. So, given that just standing in the street can be judged as a criminal act in Hong Kong, that's quite frightening. I think what it will lead to is an approach to policing where policing is far more embedded into Hong Kong society. I think that will suppress, it has the potential to suppress forms of dissent, to criminalise people. I think it won't occur in isolation, of course, that a key thrust of this is going to be a total reform of the education system. That goes in parallel with it. I think there was a General Zhu or something talked about recently. The problem was that Hong Kong hadn't rejected the colonial education model and textbooks, so they all needed to be replaced. So there's going to be a kind of ideological and cultural in-depth move to radically reform thinking, action, behaviour, criminality in the Hong Kong context. Where will that take us? Well, it's taken us where it was always going to take us, 2047, one country. It's always going in that direction. This is the Chinese state you're dealing with. It's the global superpower, the Greater Bay Project, all these kinds of economic things. So where will we be if we get through the climate crisis in 2047? Well, I would imagine that the Greater Bay will be one of the most vibrant economic hotspots on the planet. With a commercial sector driven by IT technology that is world leading, and there may well be a lot less conflict going on in Hong Kong society than there is now. Quite a long journey to go. How you'll go up and down in relationship to conflict, maybe that's something to consider, but I think there's a particular journey that you're on, and it's a road that you're traveling. Sorry about that, but that would be my view.
Question from Darren Mann. He asked whether you could comment on the responsibility of police to discriminate or differentiate between violent and non-violent protesters, and also respect symbols of protection of non-belligerent protesters like medical workers and the press and so on. Yeah,
well, again, I've spoken at length with Darren about this, and he brings some excellent perspective to it in terms of standards and international norms that have to be applied in a context where there is violent confrontation going on between protesters and the police. And it's kind of ironic that you find greater respect for those kinds of issues in a war zone than you do essentially on the streets of Hong Kong. So I think that speaks volumes about what's going on here. In terms of the broader piece about indiscriminate use of force, I think we can all see very, very clearly that from the 12th of June onwards, the use of force indiscriminately against crowds as a whole is a key characteristic of what's gone on here. But for me, it's always also been associated to the problem that was identified by Martin Perbrick's work on on the public order ordinance. You know, the public order ordinance and the force mobilisation plan that the Hong Kong police force work to. I mean, let's bear in mind that that was developed under British colonial rule to suppress Maoist uprisings in the late 1960s, and it's still being used for the purpose it was designed to achieve now. So this isn't just about policing, it's about the law that in legal terms legitimizes the criminalization of anyone who happens to be in a location that the police define as, you know, acting in a way that might lead to a breach of the peace. I mean, the idea that you can define that as a riot is quite frankly ludicrous, but there you are. That's the legal framework in which this is all taking place, and I think that's part of the problem too.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question here from Jessica Park. She asks, with your departure, you know, from the panel of experts from the IPCC and the way it happened, do you think you might be able to visit Hong Kong again? Are you worried about your ability to return?
I think it's self-evident. I mean, I'm not planning to come back anytime soon. But, you know, I'm Mr. Popular globally at the moment. I've been receiving really friendly emails from Trump supporters in America, embracing their Article 2, their amendment, you know, the Second Amendment rights, inviting me to come and visit them so they can exercise them. So, I mean, you know, I'm not alone. You know, I'd love to come back to Hong Kong, of course I would, but I don't think I'd feel safe.
Mm-hmm. Coco from Cable TV has a question again on the IPCC. You mentioned, I think in a previous interview, that you believe the report to be inadequate. Can you point to, I guess, a little bit more specifics on what you think the inadequacies are? And he's also asking to point to an example of what you think is disproportionate sort of use of force by the police, if you have one.
Okay, so before we even went there, Sir Dennis and I began to lobby the IPCC to open the door to a broader range of evidence, because the IPCC had taken a decision that the only evidence they were going to consider was that given to them by the police. And even there, they lack investigatory powers to check the veracity and validity of the information that the police give them. Now, that's no standard empirical basis for making an objective consideration about what's gone on. So we lobbied them, and as a function of that, on the Wednesday, we managed to get an agreement that we could interview legal representatives of those people that have been arrested. And prior to that, we'd also got agreement to get representation from academics, and we heard from Professor Francis Lee. And we also got permission to go and talk to protesters on the Friday. And what we heard there was really quite revealing. It was interesting that none of that information found its way into the report, but it flagged up what I believe to be a really quite unfocused, you know, people aren't really talking about, people are talking very much about what happens on the ground during the process itself, but not very much about what happened to people who got arrested, what happened to them after they were arrested, and how the police began to operate in relationship to the detention of those that are arrested, and how that began to erode the normal processes through which those protesters who had been arrested could access legal representation. And when we heard from those solicitors, we started to hear some really quite shocking information about what had happened, in particular in relationship to the detention centre on the 11th of August. And again, that data is not in the IPCC report. They were at that meeting. And I think, again, you know, there are issues here about a lack of balance in the kind of information that inform the IPCC's judgment. There are systematic absences that need to be talked about here. And let's not lose sight of the fact that disproportionality isn't just about what the police are doing on the ground. It's what they're doing to people after they've been arrested as well. And that this speaks to us about a systematic issue at work. This isn't just rogue officers. This isn't a bad apple. This is about a systematic problem, about the way in which the police went about thinking about protest, strategically and tactically responding to protest, and then focusing on trying to resolve the conflicts that I would judge their actions provoked And there's a whole range of issues there that could and should have been considered, but they simply weren't. And I think that we have to recognise that the IPCC is not in a position to do that, because it's effectively hamstrung by its position within the political and structural politics of Hong Kong.
Well, I'm going to have the honor of asking the last question, sort of related to what you just talked about. Recent article from SEMP looked at the new sort of policing tactics that are being used on the streets here, and one of the things that really struck out to me was the police leadership talking about how they've managed to arrest X number of people even before the protests themselves have begun. From my perceptions of being on the ground, it seems like mass arrests are being used increasingly as a tool, as a tactic, on the streets. We saw it, with the January 1st protest, where everyone sort of rounded up in a specific area were arrested, and you're seeing it more and more happening now as well. Could you comment a little bit on this mass arrest tactic, and what do you think it does to de-escalate or inflame the situation, and whether you have any worries about it and how it's being used here in Hong Kong?
Well, I think it's always premised upon a particular perspective on why the violence happens in the first place. So I'm presuming here that it's driven by the idea that if you can take the agitators out, then you stop the violence, and that the violence is really just a product of pathological agitators who are fifth columnists funded by foreign regimes that are somehow distorted in their perception and drawing on the uneducated perspectives of the mob to draw them into violence. And therefore what you do is that you extract the minority from society and you reduce the conflict. Well, I suppose in the sense that you lock up thousands of people, you reduce the conflict, but you don't really do very much to protect the right of assembly. And that's a right protected under the basic law that seems to be not really much of a feature these days, given the dominance of the Public Order Act, of the POO, Public Order Ordinance, in relationship to the legal powers that the police are using to do that. So, I think here that mass arrest is always a problematic tactic. It's a basic intrusion into the right of freedom of assembly. But we've seen a whole series of protests, unprecedented level of protest, unprecedented level of violence and confrontation, and an unprecedented level of arrests and imprisonment. Will that work? Well, I suppose so in the end. I mean, if you lock everybody up, then you can stop them rioting. But I mean, as I say, it's expensive. It robs you of rights. It destabilizes society. It brings a perception of illegitimacy to the political status quo. There are so many more effective ways of achieving that end that don't involve the firing of that many munitions, don't involve arresting that many people, don't involve putting that many people in prison, don't involve destroying so many lives. And those things could have been exercised much, much earlier in the cycle, and they weren't. And the police are paying, and the Hong Kong society is paying for the mistakes that were made early on and the commitment that the police has got to this one-sided view of what the problem is and how they're going to solve it. But they're doing it, and away they go.
On that note, thank you so much for your time. It's been an honor to have you talking to us here at the FCC, and we really appreciate it. I'm sure everyone will be, really looking forward to your report on the situation in Hong Kong. So, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.